The foreclosure letter sat face down on the kitchen table for 3 days before Dale Briggs touched it again. Nora knew because she checked every morning before school. On the fourth day, it was gone. She found it in the barn, tucked under the seat of the tractor he had not been able to start since April. She did not move it. She read it where it was, crouching in the dark of the barn with the smell of old oil and dry straw around her, and she understood most of it, not the legal language at the bottom, but the number in the middle of the page, $47,200, and the date beside it, 60 days. She put the letter back exactly as she found it and walked to the house for breakfast. That was the summer of 1993, and Nora Briggs was 10 years old. Harlan County sat in the eastern corner of Kentucky, where the land folded itself into ridges and hollows that did not care about property lines or county maps. The soil in the bottoms was dark and generous when it had water. When it did not, it cracked in long, jagged lines like something breaking from the inside. The Briggs family had worked 40 acres of it for 3 generations. Dale's grandfather had cleared the first field by hand. Dale's father had run cattle on the upper pasture and corn in the bottoms. Dale grew soybeans and tobacco and occasionally corn when the price made sense. And he had done it the same careful, methodical way his father had shown him, the way that worked in good years and almost worked in bad ones. This was the third bad year in a row. The first dry summer had been manageable. Dale had reserves, and the bank had been patient. The second had cost him the cattle. He had sold the last 4 head in October of 1992 to cover the operating loan. Standing in the auction ring with his hat in his hands, while men he had known his whole life looked away so he would not see them looking. The third summer arrived without ceremony and without rain, and the soybeans in the upper field, where the soil ran sandier and shallower, began to show the strain by the last week of June. Dale Briggs was not a man who complained. He was 48 years old and had the kind of face that comes from decades of squinting into sun and wind, deep-lined and deliberate, the face of a man who thought before he spoke and usually decided not to speak. He loved the land in the way people love things they have never examined closely because the love arrived before they were old enough to question it. It was simply there, the way breathing was there. His mother, Iris, lived in the back room of the farmhouse. She was 79 years old and moved slowly now, but her mind was precise and unforgiving. She had run this farm alone for 4 years after her husband died in 1967, raising Dale and his younger brother on what the soil would give and nothing more. She had kept accounts in a ledger with a stub pencil and never missed a payment to the bank. She kept a tin box on the high shelf in her room that she had never opened in Nora's presence. And Nora had been curious about it since she was old enough to notice things on shelves. Nora was the middle child of 3. Her older brother Cass was 14 and had developed the particular indifference of teenage boys toward anything that did not involve engines or other boys his age. Her younger sister Wren was 7 and followed Nora with the devotion of a shadow. Nora herself was the kind of child that adults describe as quiet and means something more than the word contains. She watched things. She watched the way water moved across the upper field after a rain, where it ran fast and where it pooled, where the soil held it and where it shed it like an unwanted coat. She watched the way her father walked the rows in the evening, and she could tell from the angle of his shoulders how bad the day had been before he said a single word. She had been watching the water problem for 2 years. The issue with the upper north field was not complicated once you understood it, but understanding it required paying attention to the ground rather than the equipment, and most people who came to look at the Briggs farm looked at the equipment. The north field sat 14 feet higher than the pond at the south end of the property. It was sandy and quick draining, which meant water moved through it before the roots of the soybean plants could use it. During normal rainfall years, this was manageable. During a drought, it was a slow catastrophe happening in plain sight. The county extension agent, a steady man named Clifton Barr, had come out twice to assess the situation. He was in his mid-50s, had worked Harlan County for over 20 years, and knew most of the farms in the region the way a doctor knows his long-term patients. He had recommended irrigating more frequently and mulching around the plant base to retain moisture. These were sound recommendations. They were also expensive, and they addressed the symptom rather than the cause. Nora had listened to Clifton Barr from the doorway of the barn both times he visited, and she had asked him one question during his second visit, speaking from behind her father in a voice so quiet that Barr had to lean slightly forward to hear. She asked if the pressure in an irrigation line drops as it runs uphill. What happens to the water that never reaches the top? Barr had looked at her the way adults look at children who ask questions that are slightly outside the frame of the conversation. He said it just stops, sits in the line. She nodded once and did not ask anything else. That was in May. By the middle of June, she had started thinking about pipes. Here is what Nora understood that the adults around her had not quite assembled into a single thought. Water does not care about money. It does not care about the price of diesel or the interest rate on an agricultural loan. It only obeys gravity, and gravity is free. The north field sat above a natural draw on the western edge of the property, a shallow depression where rainwater pooled after storms and stood for days before soaking in or evaporating. That draw sat approximately 9 feet above the problem rows. 9 feet of elevation, run through the right pipe network, with sufficient head pressure to gravity feed a drip irrigation system without a single pump. She had read this in one of her grandmother's pamphlets. Iris kept a collection of agricultural extension documents that she had been gathering since the early 1960s. They were stacked in a wooden crate under her bed, along with seed catalogs and back issues of a small farming journal that had stopped publishing in 1978. Nora had been reading them for 2 years with the same methodical interest her grandmother brought to them, which is to say, she read them the way most children read adventure stories, looking for the part where the problem gets solved. The pamphlet about gravity-fed drip irrigation had been printed by the University of Tennessee Extension Service in 1961. It described systems used by small-scale farmers in the hill country before electric pumps became standard, systems that delivered water directly to plant roots through slow emitters, losing almost nothing to evaporation, using a fraction of what overhead sprinklers required. The math was in the pamphlet. Nora had done it twice on the back of a paper bag she found in the kitchen drawer. The problem was the pipes. New drip irrigation equipment cost money the Briggs family did not have, but old pipe was everywhere if you knew how to look, sitting at the edges of fields, on farms where newer systems had replaced them. Aluminum lateral pipe and old PVC that farmers had stopped using and not bothered to haul away. It had no market value. It was simply there, rusting in the grass, waiting for someone to see it differently. On the first Saturday of July, Nora loaded her bicycle with a length of rope and a folded sheet of paper on which she had written the names and road numbers of 7 farms within 4 miles of the Briggs property. She left before her father was up. She was back by noon with her rope tied around a bundle of aluminum pipe sections that scraped and rattled against the rear wheel of her bicycle the entire way home. She stacked them against the side of the barn and went back out the following Saturday. The farmers she approached were uniformly puzzled and uniformly generous. Most of them were in their 50s and 60s, men who had worked the same land for decades and recognized in Nora's directness something they respected even when they did not understand it. She asked for their old pipe. She did not explain why. They said yes, the way people say yes when a child asks for something that costs them nothing. And then they leaned on their fence posts and watched her load the pipe into the wooden trailer her father had built her. And some of them chuckled, the gentle, baffled kind of laughter that comes not from cruelty, but from having no framework for what they were seeing. An 11-year-old girl collecting irrigation pipe. Help yourself, honey. She was not 11. She was 10. But no one had asked. Victor Crane came to the Briggs farm on the 14th of July. He came alone, which was unusual for him. His normal practice, as several families in the county had learned over the previous 3 years, was to arrive with a representative from Harlan Valley Agricultural Services, the company he had built from a single equipment dealership into a regional operation that now supplied machinery. crop inputs, and financing to more than 40 farms. He had a way of conducting these visits that felt like courtesy and functioned like pressure, arriving with paperwork already prepared, staying just long enough to let the weight of the numbers settle into the room. He drove a late model pickup, dark green, without a spot of mud on it despite the county road. He was 44 years old and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from having been right often enough to stop considering the possibility of being wrong. He wore a collared shirt with the top button open, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was not flashy. That was part of what made him effective. Dale was in the equipment barn when Crane pulled in. Nora was in the side yard, pulling a second load of pipe off the trailer. Crane got out of the truck and looked at the yard for a moment before he looked at Dale. He looked at the pipe stacked against the barn wall. Then he looked at the girl moving it. He said, "What is she building?" Dale wiped his hands on a rag and said he was not sure. Crane watched Nora for a moment longer, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite concern. Then he turned to Dale and the visit began in earnest. He had come, he said, because he had heard about the difficulty with the North Field. He had heard about the equipment problem, which he framed as an unfortunate technical issue rather than what it was, which was a defect in a product his company had sold. He spoke about the second dry summer and the third, about the stress all the small operations in the county were under, about the importance of thinking long-term in circumstances like these. Then he made his offer, $180,000 for the Briggs property, land and improvements, to be paid within 30 days of signing. He laid a folder on the hood of Dale's truck and opened it to a single page. Dale did not look at the page. He looked at Victor Crane. He said, "This land belonged to my grandfather." Crane said he understood that, and that was exactly why he was making a fair offer while there was still time to make one. The word time sat in the air between them like something with weight. Dale said no. He said it the way a man says something he has said before in his own mind many times and does not need to examine further. Then he walked back into the barn. Crane closed the folder. He looked at Nora again, who had stopped moving pipe and was standing at the edge of the yard, watching him with the steady, unreadable attention she gave to most things. He held her gaze for a moment, and she did not look away. He got back in the truck and left. Nora watched the truck until it turned onto the county road. Then she went back to unloading pipe. 3 days later, the Crane Agritech system went wrong for the second time. It had begun failing 6 weeks after installation, the pressure dropping irregularly, the lines to the north field delivering uneven flow that left some rows oversaturated and others dry. The first service call had produced a technician who spent 40 minutes at the pump station, adjusted 2 settings, and told Dale the system needed time to calibrate to local soil conditions. The second failure was worse. The main pump ran continuously for 11 hours during a night in mid-July, overloading the motor, and by morning the system had shut down entirely. The Crane Agritech technician who came for the second service call was younger than the first one and carried a clipboard with pre-printed forms. He walked the north field with Dale, asked a series of questions, and then told Dale that the slope of the terrain in the north field exceeded the operational parameters specified in the installation contract. Dale said he did not remember any discussion of operational parameters. The technician showed him page 11 of the contract. It was printed in type so small, Dale had to hold it at arm's length. The warranty exclusion applied to installations where field grade exceeded 8%. The north field grade at Crane Agritech's own survey measurement was 11%. Repair of the motor and recalibration of the system would cost $11,500. This cost was not covered under warranty. Dale stood in the field for a long time after the technician left. Nora was watching from the fence line. She said nothing. She went into the house, found the copy of the installation contract in the kitchen drawer where Dale kept important papers, and took it to her room. The contract was 18 pages. She read all of them. She found the grade exclusion on page 11, as the technician had said. She also found something else, A clause on page 14 that described the terrain assessment process Crane Agritech was required to conduct before installation, including a slope measurement using a standardized instrument. The clause stated that if the assessment identified terrain outside operational parameters, the customer was to be notified in writing before the contract was signed. She sat with that for a long time. Then she put the contract back in the kitchen drawer, took her bicycle, and rode to Wendell Coe's farm. Wendell Coe was 70 years old and had run a commercial vegetable operation on 60 acres of Harlan County land from 1961 until he closed it in 1989 when his knees gave out and his two sons told him they were not interested in farming. He lived alone in a white house at the end of a gravel lane and spent most of his time in a barn full of irrigation equipment he had not been able to bring himself to sell. He had given Nora 3 sections of aluminum lateral pipe the previous Saturday without asking a single question, and she had decided he was the kind of man who could be trusted with a more complicated request. She showed him the sketch, her grandmother's sketch, the one from 1962. She had asked Iris for it that morning. Iris had looked at her steadily for a moment, then gone to her room and come back with the tin box. She opened it at the kitchen table. The sketch was folded in thirds, handwritten in pencil on graph paper, the lines still clear after 31 years. Around the edges, in her grandmother's small, precise handwriting, were notes and measurements and a series of calculations that Nora had read twice and not fully understood. Wendell put on his reading glasses and looked at the sketch for a long time without speaking. He turned it over, read the notes on the back, and then set it down and looked out the barn door at nothing in particular. He said, "I saw something like this in Tennessee. 1971. Man named Aldrich ran it on a 20-acre hillside farm. Worked better than anything powered by a motor. Nora asked if he thought it would work on the Briggs North field. The old man said he thought it might work better there than it did for Aldrich, because the Briggs property had something Aldrich's had not." He picked up the sketch again and pointed to a notation in the lower left corner, written in smaller pencil than the rest. It was a measurement and a direction. Northwest corner of the property, 4 feet below grade. He said whoever drew this put a note here about a subsurface water accumulation. You know what that means. Nora said she thought it meant there was water underground. Wendell said it meant reliable water underground, the kind fed by a slow percolating spring that would not dry up in a drought the way a surface draw would. He said in 30 years of irrigation work, he had never once seen a small farm operator think to incorporate a subsurface source into a gravity-fed system. He said whoever drew this sketch had been paying very close attention to the land for a very long time. Nora did not tell him her grandmother had drawn it. She folded the sketch carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She asked Wendell if he would trade larger diameter pipe for the smaller sections she had already collected. He said he would. She asked if he would show her how to fit them. He said he would do that too. She rode home in the late afternoon with 3 sections of 4-inch aluminum mainline strapped to the trailer behind her bicycle. The shadows of the fence posts ran long across the dry grass. She could hear the soybeans in the upper field doing what drought-stressed soybeans do, which is nothing, which is the sound of waiting. That evening at dinner, Dale asked her what she was doing with all the pipe. She said she was going to irrigate the north field without the pump. The table was quiet. Cass looked up from his plate. Wren watched Nora with wide eyes. Dale set down his fork. He said, "How?" She said, "Gravity." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether to ask more questions or let it stand. He was a man who believed in seeing results before forming opinions, and he applied this principle to his children the same way he applied it to equipment and seed varieties and weather forecasts. He picked his fork back up. He said, "All right." Iris, at the end of the table, said nothing, but she was watching Nora with an expression that had something old and unresolved in it, something that had been waiting a long time to see which direction it would finally go. That night, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, Nora spread the graph paper sketch on the floor of her room next to a hand-drawn map of the Briggs property that she had copied from the county plat book at school. She laid them side by side and began to trace connections between the two. The draw on the western edge, the north field rose, the subsurface notation in the lower corner, the elevation differences she had paced off herself over 3 Saturday mornings. She worked until the lamp beside her bed began to flicker, which it did when the generator needed fuel. She folded the papers carefully and put them under her mattress. Outside, the north field sat dark and silent. The soil was cracked along the row tops, pale and powdery at the surface, holding almost nothing now. Further down the slope, the draw that her grandmother had noted in her careful pencil handwriting held whatever moisture was left in the ground, quiet and unassuming, unknown to anyone who had not been paying close attention for a very long time. Nora lay in the dark and thought about water and gravity and the particular stubbornness of things that work slowly. She was 10 years old. She was not worried. She was planning. She started before sunrise the next morning, not with the full system, with a single line, one section of 4-inch main pipe running from the edge of the draw down to the first 2 rows of the north field. She needed to know if the pressure calculation in her grandmother's sketch was right before she committed the rest of the pipe. She needed to see water move. It did not move. Not enough. The emitters at the end of the run produced a weak, irregular drip that soaked maybe 3 feet of soil before losing momentum entirely. She lay flat on the ground and watched the wet spot for 10 minutes. Then she stood up, disconnected the line, and thought about what she had seen. The failure was not in the elevation. The elevation was right. The failure was in the transition. The point where the 4-inch main narrowed down to the smaller lateral pipe she had collected from the neighboring farms. The diameter change was too abrupt. Pressure that had been building across the length of the main line bled away the moment it hit the narrow fitting. Like a river running into a drainage ditch, the water had nowhere to go but slow down. She went back to Wendell Coe that afternoon. He listened to her describe what had happened, then walked to the back of his barn without speaking and came back with a set of graduated reducer fittings still in their original packaging, dusty but unused, bought for the Tennessee vegetable system in 1971 and never opened. He set them on the workbench. He said, "Step down gradual. Never jump from 4-inch to 1/2 inch in one fitting." That is in the notes on the back of the sketch. Nora had read the notes on the back of the sketch. She had not understood that particular line until now. She took the fittings home and spent the rest of the afternoon reconfiguring the transition point. Cass came out once to look, made a comment she did not respond to, and went back inside. Wren sat on the fence rail and handed Nora tools she did not always need, but always took anyway. Dale passed through the yard twice without stopping. The second time he slowed his pace slightly, looked at what she was assembling, and kept walking. She understood this as encouragement. The Crane Agritech system died completely the following Thursday. It did not go slowly. The repaired motor ran for 6 hours after the technician's second visit, then tripped a breaker, reset automatically at 3 in the morning, ran for another 4 hours, and finally seized in a way that produced a burning smell that reached the farmhouse before Dale was out of bed. He walked to the pump station in the early dark and stood looking at the equipment until the mud dauber working in the corner of the door frame finished its business and flew off. Then he went back inside. At breakfast, he did not speak. Wren ate quietly. Cass looked at his plate. Nora watched her father's hands wrapped around his coffee cup and thought about the foreclosure letter she had read in the barn, about the number 47,200 and the date beside it. She counted the days remaining in her head. The number was not large. The crane technician who came for the third service call arrived in the late afternoon. He was a different man from either of the previous two, older, with the careful, measured manner of someone sent to deliver information rather than fix anything. He inspected the motor housing for roughly 12 minutes. He told Dale the damage was beyond field repair and the unit would need to be removed and returned to the service center. The timeline for repair was 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks was past the bank's deadline by a significant margin. Dale asked about the warranty. The technician said the warranty position had not changed. The grade exclusion applied. After he left, Dale stood in the pump station doorway. The afternoon light came through the gaps in the siding in long yellow bars. He looked at the dead equipment with the expression of a man who has run out of things to argue with. Nora was at the edge of the yard. She had been there long enough to hear most of it. She went inside, took the installation contract from the kitchen drawer, and read page 14 again, then a third time. The language was precise in a way that legal language sometimes is when precision is meant to be used against the person reading it. Crane Agritech was required to conduct a terrain assessment before installation. The terrain assessment was required to include slope measurement. If slope exceeded operational parameters, written notification to the customer was required before contract execution. There had been no written notification. She was certain of that because she had read all 18 pages twice and found no attachment, no addendum, no letter on company letterhead, only a signature line at the bottom of page 1 above Dale Briggs's signature, and below it the signature of a Crane Agritech sales representative named T. Moffett. She folded the contract, put it in her jacket pocket alongside the sketch, and went back outside. Victor Crane came to the Briggs farm 11 days before the bank's deadline. He did not come alone this time. He arrived with a man in a gray suit who carried a leather document case and introduced himself as a representative of Harlan Valley Agricultural Services. The gray suit man set the document case on the hood of the truck and opened it with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times in many farmyards. Crane did not look at the case. He looked at the house, at the barn, at the north field visible over the fence line where the soybeans stood in uneven rows, some pale and beginning to curl at the edges, some slightly better where Nora's test line had delivered water the previous week. He said to Dale, "We have acquired your note from the bank." Dale said nothing. Crane said the total outstanding obligation, including fees, was $47,200. 11 days remained under the original instrument. The terms of the acquisition were identical. The gray suit man removed a document from the case and set it on the hood. Crane said this was a transfer agreement. It consolidated the existing debt into a single payment structure. If the payment could not be met in 11 days, the transfer agreement provided a clean path to resolution. Dale looked at the document. Resolution was a particular kind of word. Nora had heard it used before, by the extension agent and by the man from the bank who had come the previous fall. And she had noticed that it always seemed to mean the same thing when bankers and lawyers used it, which was that someone was going to lose something and the paperwork was there to make that seem like a mutual decision. She was sitting on the porch steps. She had come outside when she heard the truck. Crane looked at her. It was the same look he had given her the first time he came, that careful assessing attention that was different from the way most adults looked at children. He did not dismiss her. He looked at her the way you look at something you are trying to understand the function of. She looked back at him without any particular expression. He said to Dale, "Take the time you need to review it. We will need it back by Friday." The gray suit man closed the document case. They left. Dale picked up the document from the hood of his truck and carried it inside. Nora did not follow him immediately. She sat on the steps a while longer, watching the dust from Crane's truck settle back onto the county road. Then she went to find her grandmother. Iris was standing at the window of her room when Nora knocked, one hand resting on the sill, looking out at the east field. She turned when Nora came in and moved to the chair without being asked. The slow, deliberate economy of a woman who had learned to conserve motion without surrendering it. Nora sat on the edge of the bed. She told her grandmother what had happened with the second test line. She described the pressure failure at the transition fitting and what Wendell had told her about the graduated reducers and the notation on the back of the sketch she had not understood at first. She did this carefully and completely, The way you report to someone who needs accurate information to give good advice. Iris listened without moving. When Nora finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Iris said the northwest corner. Did you mark it? Nora said she had paced it off and put a stake in the ground. Iris said your grandfather walked that corner every spring for 40 years. He knew the water was there. He said it was not enough to matter. He was wrong about several things. She said it without bitterness, as a statement of fact, the way you acknowledge a miscalculation after you have had 30 years to review the numbers. Nora asked why she had never built the system herself. Iris looked toward the window. She said Earl told her women did not understand water pressure. She told him she had drawn the calculations out and they were correct. He said calculations on paper were different from real work. By the time she understood he was not going to change his mind, the summer was over. The next summer he was sick. The summer after that, he was gone. And then she was too busy holding everything together to do anything except hold everything together. She paused. She said I should have built it the first summer. Nora did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say to that. She took the sketch from her jacket pocket and unfolded it on the bed beside her. The two of them sat together in the quiet room looking at it. Outside, the east field was still and pale in the afternoon heat. The soybeans in the rows nearest the fence stood upright. The ones further out were beginning to lean. That evening, Dale read the transfer agreement at the kitchen table. He read it slowly and completely, holding the paper slightly away from him as if distance helped with difficult information. When he finished, he put it down and looked at the wall for a while. Then he got up, went out to the barn, and did not come back in until after Nora and Wren were in bed. She heard him come in. She heard him sit down at the kitchen table. She heard the sound of a pen being uncapped. She lay in the dark and thought about what that sound meant. She did not sleep for a long time. She was up before 4. The house was dark and still. She went to the kitchen. The transfer agreement was on the table, with Dale's initials in the lower left corner of the first page. The preliminary mark that indicated review, but not yet full signature. The pen was beside it. She stood looking at his handwriting. His initials were heavy and deliberate, the letters of a man who had signed his name to difficult things before and had not yet found a way to stop having to. She picked up the transfer agreement, folded it twice, and put it in her jacket pocket. She put the pen back in the drawer. She took the installation contract from the pocket where she had been carrying it for 2 days and placed it on the table where the transfer agreement had been. Then she went outside. The second system failed on the first attempt. She had reconfigured the transition fittings based on Wendell's instructions, stepped down from the 4-inch main to a 2-inch secondary, and then to the emitter laterals in gradual increments. The pressure at the test point was better. It reached the first row, moved through the second, began to slow at the third. At the fourth row, the flow from the emitters was too weak to penetrate more than an inch of dry soil. She pressed her face close to the fourth row emitter line and watched the water bead and sit on the surface without moving. The problem was volume. There was not enough water coming from the draw. The draw was a surface collection point, and the surface was dry. What was left in it was being divided across too long a line. The pressure math in her grandmother's sketch assumed a stronger source flow than the summer drought had left in the draw. She stayed there for a while, not moving. Then she thought about what Wendell had said about the northwest corner, about the subsurface accumulation her grandmother had noted on the sketch, about the fact that her grandfather had walked that corner for 40 years and decided the water was not worth using, and that her grandmother had disagreed and never been given the chance to prove it. She stood up, brushed the soil from her shirt, and walked to the northwest corner of the north field. The ground there looked the same as everywhere else. Dry surface, cracked along the top inch, pale where the sun had been hitting it directly. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the soil. She waited. Then she pressed harder. Underneath the dry crust, the soil was different. Not wet, but not the same hollow dryness as the rows further south. There was a density to it, a slight coolness at an inch below the surface that did not match the surrounding ground. She found a steel rod in the equipment barn, one of the ones Dale used to probe for buried rocks before tilling. She brought it back to the northwest corner and pushed it into the soil at 6-inch intervals across a 12-foot section of the fence line. At most points, the rod went in 4 inches before hitting the resistance of summer-hardened subsoil. At 2 points, roughly 3 feet apart, it went in 8 inches before stopping. And the soil that came up on the rod when she pulled it was darker, slightly moist, clinging rather than crumbling. She pushed the rod in at a 45-degree angle at those 2 points, driving it deep, and at 14 inches, it stopped with a different kind of resistance. Not the hard stop of rock or compacted clay, but the slower cushioned stop of saturated ground. The water was there. Her grandmother's notation had been right for 31 years, and nobody had looked. She left the rod in the ground as a marker and went to get Wendell Coe. He drove his truck to the northwest corner and crouched down where she showed him. He pressed his own hands into the soil the same way she had. He probed with the rod. He stood up slowly, using the fence post for support, and looked at the 2 dark spots on the rod's surface where the moist soil had clung. He said that is a percolating spring feed. Slow, very slow. But in a drought summer, it does not stop because it does not come from the surface. It comes from the water table. Nora asked how you connect it to a gravity line. Wendell looked at the ground for a while. He said the approach was called a collector tile, a perforated pipe buried horizontal at the depth of the water, which would gather the slow seep and direct it into the main line rather than letting it disperse into the surrounding soil and evaporate. It was an old technique, pre-war. Nobody used it anymore because it required hand digging and patience, and most operations had moved to powered systems that did not need either. He looked at her. He said you would need to dig about a 12-foot trench at roughly 14 inches. Nora said she had a shovel. Wendell said he had 2. They dug the trench together that afternoon, Wendell working one end and Nora the other, meeting in the middle as the sun moved across the ridge. The soil was hard at the surface and softer below, and at 14 inches, the change in the ground was unmistakable. The slight give of moisture-held clay, the smell of cool earth that does not have that smell when it is dry all the way through. Wendell had brought a length of perforated drain tile in the bed of his truck, wrapped in filter fabric to keep the fine soil from clogging the perforations. They laid it in the trench, sloped toward the northwest corner post, and connected it to a short section of solid pipe that ran to a collection chamber, a steel bucket with a screened inlet that Wendell had drilled and fitted on his workbench 20 years ago and never used. They covered the trench, packed the soil back down, and stood at the collection chamber and waited. For the first several minutes, nothing happened. Nora stood with her hands at her sides and did not look at Wendell because she did not want to see anything on his face that was not confidence. Then the pipe leading from the collection chamber began to produce a sound, a very small, ticking gurgle, and then a thin thread of water appeared at the outlet end, caught the afternoon light for a moment, and ran down into the main line. It was not much, but it was steady. Wendell said that is what steady looks like when it comes from underground. It does not rush. It does not impress anybody. It just does not stop. That evening, Dale came home from the equipment barn to find Nora at the kitchen table with the installation contract spread in front of her alongside a page of handwritten notes. He looked at the table. He looked for the transfer agreement. He said, "Where is the paper crane left?" She told him she had it. She said she needed 2 more days. He looked at her for a long time. Dale Briggs was not a man who gave authority to children in the way some fathers do, the generous, easy way that comes without cost. When he gave authority, it was because something in him had made a considered decision that the person in front of him had earned it. She could see him making that decision now, weighing what he knew about her against what he knew about their situation, working through the arithmetic of trust versus risk in the careful, methodical way he worked through all arithmetic. He said 2 days. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And then we talk." She said, "Yes, sir." He went to the stove and started heating water for coffee. She turned back to her notes. The kitchen was quiet around them, except for the sound of the burner catching and the evening insects starting up outside the screen door. Iris appeared in the hallway doorway. She looked at the table, at the contract, at Nora's handwritten notes. She looked at Dale. She said, "She is doing what I should have done in 1962. Dale looked at his mother. He said, "What does that mean?" Iris said, "It means let her finish." She turned and went back to her room. Dale stood at the stove, looking at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he turned back to the coffee. Nora wrote for another hour after dinner. She wrote down the dates from the contract. She wrote down the notation on page 14 about the terrain assessment requirement. She wrote down Moffat's name from the signature line. She wrote down the grade measurement from the warranty exclusion and the actual grade measurement the technician had given Dale, 11%, and the date the technician had given that measurement, and the date the contract had been signed, which was 6 weeks earlier. The sequence was clear on paper. The assessment had either been conducted and the result concealed from Dale before he signed, or it had not been conducted at all. Either way, page 14 had not been followed. She did not know what to do with that information yet. She knew it was important. She knew it was the kind of thing that mattered to someone who had authority over contracts and companies and what they were and were not allowed to do to farming families in Harlan County, Kentucky. She did not know who that person was, but she knew Wendell Coe had been working in this county for 30 years. And she knew Clifton Barr had been the extension agent here for over 20. And she knew that the people who had been paying attention to one piece of ground for a long time usually knew who else was paying attention. She folded the contract and the notes together and put them under her mattress with her grandmother's sketch. Outside, in the northwest corner of the north field, the collector tile ran quiet and slow in the dark ground, gathering water from the same deep source her grandmother had noticed 31 years ago and her grandfather had told her was not worth the trouble. The water did not know about the disagreement. It just kept moving, finding the lowest point, filling what it could reach. Patient in a way that has nothing to do with patience because it has nothing to do with choice. It simply ran. She did not wake her father. If it failed a third time, she did not want him watching. She was outside by 4:15, moving through the dark by memory. The ground was familiar enough under her feet that she did not need the flashlight until she reached the collection chamber at the northwest corner. She crouched there for a moment and listened. The thin, steady sound was still there. The tile was still running. She put her hand over the outlet pipe and felt the faint coolness of moving water against her palm. Still steady, still slow, still enough. She had spent the previous evening reconfiguring the entire transition sequence one more time. Not just the fittings at the draw, but the full run from the collection chamber through the main line to the first emitter lateral. Wendell had sat on a feed bucket in the equipment barn and talked her through the diameter calculations while she worked. Not touching anything himself, letting her hands do it, correcting her only when she reached for a fitting that would lose pressure rather than maintain it. They had worked until past 9. Her father had come to the barn door at 8:30, looked at the two of them, and gone back to the house without saying anything. The full reconfigured system was 43 feet of 4-inch main line from the collection chamber down to the first junction, then branching into 2-inch secondary lines running along the row tops, stepping down through graduated fittings to the emitter laterals that ran between the plants at soil level. 71 emitters across 6 rows. Each emitter a small brass fitting with a hole the diameter of a finishing nail that would let water through at a rate of half a gallon per hour. Half a gallon per hour was not impressive. Half a gallon per hour delivered directly to a root zone in dry soil, without losing a drop to evaporation or surface runoff, for 8 to 10 hours a day, was something different from what it sounded like. She opened the inlet valve on the collection chamber and walked the full length of the main line in the dark, kneeling at each junction, pressing her fingers against the fittings to feel for the faint vibration that meant pressure was building rather than bleeding away. At the first junction it was there. At the second it was there. She waited at the third junction for 2 full minutes before she felt it. fainter but present. The quiet pulse of water finding its level through a system designed to let it. She walked to the end of the first emitter lateral and crouched down. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the first emitter produced a sound too small to call a drip. A single bead of water formed at the brass fitting, held for a moment in the surface tension of its own weight, and then let go into the dry soil. Then the second emitter, then the fourth, then the third, which ran a half-second behind the others for reasons she did not entirely understand, but stopped trying to understand because all 6 laterals were running now. Every emitter working, each one delivering its thin, patient thread of water into the ground that had been waiting since April. She sat back on her heels in the dark between the rows and did not move for a while. The soybeans around her did not look different. They were still pale and heat-stressed, still showing the curl at the leaf edges that came from water debt accumulated over weeks. The change would not be visible for days, but the soil directly beneath each emitter was darkening, a small circle of moisture spreading outward from each brass fitting, the dry ground accepting water the way dry ground does when water finally arrives, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, simply taking what it needs. She walked back to the house as the sky began to lighten along the eastern ridge. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink and sat down at the table. She took out the installation contract and her handwritten notes and read through everything one more time in the growing light. Then she went to knock on her grandmother's door. Iris was already awake. She was at the small desk in the corner of her room, the one she used for correspondence, her reading glasses on, and a cup of black coffee at her elbow. She looked up when Nora came in. Nora said the system was running. Iris set down her pen. She looked at Nora for a moment without speaking. She said, "Good." Nora asked if she could borrow the tin box. Iris reached to the shelf without getting up and brought it down and held it out without hesitation, as if she had been expecting this request for some time. Nora took it to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside, beneath the sketch and the agricultural pamphlets, there were other papers she had not examined the first time. She went through them now with the same attention she gave to everything she read. There were seed purchase receipts from the 1950s, a letter from the County Extension Service dated 1963 addressed to Earl Briggs regarding soil composition testing results, a hand-copied table of rainfall measurements for Harlan County from 1940 through 1968 written in Iris's small, precise hand, and at the bottom, folded in a separate piece of waxed paper as if it had been kept apart from the rest deliberately, a single sheet of paper with the letterhead of Harlan County Agricultural Bank. It was dated August 14th, 1961. It was a paid-in-full notice for a loan of $4,200, signed by the bank manager and countersigned by Earl Briggs. At the bottom, in the margin, in handwriting that was not Earl's and was not Iris's, was a brief notation. It read, "Property unencumbered as of this date. Water rights appurtenant. Survey on file. County Recorder. Book 7, page 214. Nora read the notation 3 times. She did not fully understand what appurtenant meant, but she understood water rights. She had read enough of her grandmother's pamphlets to know that in Kentucky, water rights attached to land were a separate legal matter from the land itself, and that they could be registered separately, and that a registered water right was a documented claim that predated any later agreement about the same property. She added the waxed paper and its contents to her stack of documents. When Dale came down at 6, he found Nora at the kitchen table with 4 items arranged in a row in front of her. The Crane Agritech installation contract, her page of handwritten notes, the 1961 bank notice, and her grandmother's sketch, unfolded and laid flat. He stood in the doorway looking at the table. She said, "I need to go see Clifton Barr this morning, before the bank inspector comes." Dale said the inspector was coming at 10. She said she knew. She needed an hour. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. He said, "What are you going to show him?" She said the contract, page 14. And this? She picked up the 1961 bank notice and turned it toward him so he could read the notation in the margin. Dale read it. He read it again. He looked at the word appurtenant the way a man looks at a word he has not seen before but suspects is important. He said, "Where did that come from?" Nora said Grandma kept it, in the tin box. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. From the back of the house came the sound of Iris moving around in her room, the slow, deliberate sounds of a woman who has learned to conserve motion but has not stopped moving. Dale set the bank notice back on the table. He pulled out the chair across from Nora and sat down. He looked at everything laid out in front of her and then looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, because the surprise had been accumulating for weeks and was past the point of being surprising. Something more like the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just understood that he does not have to. He said, "Tell me what you found." She told him. She went through it in order. Page 14 and the terrain assessment requirement, the grade measurements and the dates. T. Moffat's signature and what it obligated the company to do before the contract was signed. She told him about the water rights notation and what she understood it to mean. And she told him she did not fully understand all of it, and that was why she needed Clifton Barr. Because Barr had been working this county for over 20 years and would know who else needed to see it. Dale listened without interrupting, looking at the documents as she pointed to each section, occasionally looking up at her face as if checking the source against the content. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. He said, "You are 10 years old." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Where did you learn to read a contract like that?" She said Grandma's pamphlets had one about farm equipment financing from 1959. It explained what warranty exclusions were and why you had to read the small type. Dale looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her. He said, "Go get your shoes." Clifton Barr's office was in a low brick building on the east side of Harlan, shared with the Soil Conservation Service and a small agricultural lending office that was not affiliated with the bank. He was there when they arrived at 7:40, which did not surprise Dale because Barr had always been there early, as long as Dale could remember. Barr was a solid, deliberate man who had the patience of someone whose work moved at the speed of seasons. He looked up when they came in, said good morning, looked at Nora, looked at what she was carrying, and said, "Sit down." She laid the documents out on his desk the same way she had laid them on the kitchen table. She went through the explanation once, carefully, pointing to each section as she described it. Barr read page 14 of the installation contract slowly. He read it again. He looked at the grade measurements and the dates. He picked up the 1961 bank notice and read the margin notation and held it for a moment without speaking. He said, "Where is this survey?" Book 7, page 214. Nora said she did not know how to look that up. Barr said, "I do." He made a phone call to the county recorder's office. He was on hold for 4 minutes, during which he looked at the documents on his desk without touching them, the steady, focused look of a man organizing information. When someone came back on the line, he gave them the reference numbers and waited. He wrote something on a notepad. He thanked the person and hung up. He said the survey is on file. The water rights registration is valid and current. It has never been challenged and never been transferred. It is attached to the Briggs property by name. Dale said, "What does that mean for the note?" Barr said it meant the property had a registered water right that predated the current loan instruments by 30 years. A property with a registered water right in Harlan County had a different assessed value than one without. It meant the collateral basis on which the note was structured might not accurately reflect what the property was actually worth. He paused. He said that is a matter for a lawyer to argue properly, but I can tell you that the bank underwriter should have seen this in the title search before the loan was written. And I can tell you that Crane Agritech, selling equipment to a farm with an active water rights registration, without disclosing the terrain assessment finding that would have affected the contract, is a matter the State Agriculture Board has authority to review. He looked at Nora. He said, "Did you find all of this yourself?" She said, "Wendell Coe had helped with the pipe. Her grandmother had kept the documents." Barr said, "And the contract. The page 14 issue." She said she had read it herself. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he picked up his phone again. He made 2 calls before 10 o'clock. The first was to a lawyer in Harlan named Margaret Dowell, who handled agricultural property cases and who had successfully challenged an equipment financing contract on warranty grounds 3 years earlier in Letcher County. The second was to the Kentucky Department of Agriculture's Regional Compliance Office in Lexington, where a staff examiner named Kenneth Holt was assigned to review complaints against agricultural equipment dealers operating in the eastern counties. Barr described the page 14 finding in specific terms. Holt asked for a copy by mail and said he would be in touch within 2 weeks. 2 weeks was not 11 days. But Barr also called the Harlan County Agricultural Bank on the drive back to the farm and spoke to the branch manager, a man named Gerald Sims, who had been at the bank for 18 years and who understood that Clifton Barr's professional opinion carried weight in the county's farming community. Barr told Sims that the Briggs property loan was under potential review due to collateral valuation discrepancies related to an unregistered water rights assessment. He said he was advising Dale Briggs to consult legal counsel before any transfer documents were finalized. He said he was putting that advice in writing to the bank as well. Gerald Sims said he would note the flag on the account. A flagged account could not be transferred under standard procedure until the flag was cleared. The 11-day deadline, in practical terms, had just become something different. Victor Crane arrived at the Briggs farm at 9:50. He came alone, the dark green truck without mud, the same collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was carrying the document case himself this time, which suggested he had expected this to be a short visit. Dale was standing in the yard when he pulled in. Nora was at the edge of the north field. Clifton Barr's truck was parked along the fence line. Barr himself was walking the emitter laterals between the soybean rows, crouching occasionally to look at the soil surface, making notes on his clipboard. Crane got out of the truck and looked at Barr. He looked at Dale. He looked at the north field. The soybeans were not transformed. 3 days of water could not undo 8 weeks of drought. But the difference was visible if you knew what you were looking at. The rows serviced by Nora's system stood differently from the rows outside it. Not dramatically, not the way it would look in 2 more weeks. But the leaves were less curled. The color was shifting from the yellow-tinged pale of water stress towards something with more depth in it. The soil between the plants was dark and cohesive where the emitters had been running. Crane walked to the fence and looked at the field for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora, who was standing at the end of the first emitter row with her hands at her sides. He said to Dale, "What is this?" Dale said, "Gravity irrigation. My daughter built it." Crane looked at the system. He looked at the collector chamber in the northwest corner, the main line running down the slope, the branching laterals between the rows. He had sold irrigation equipment for 15 years and could read a system the way a mechanic reads an engine. He understood what he was looking at, and he understood something else in the same moment, which was that the water source for this system was not the surface draw at the western edge of the field. The draw was too dry. The volume running through those laterals came from somewhere that had not dried up. He said, "Where's the water coming from?" Nora said, "The northwest corner, 14 inches down. My grandmother found it in 1962. Crane looked at her. Then he looked at the corner of the field. Something moved through his expression, not the assessing attention from his earlier visits, but something more complicated than that. He said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up the document case and started toward the house. Dale said, "Clifton Barr has flagged the loan account. You will want to talk to your own counsel before we discuss the transfer agreement." Crane stopped. Dale said it quietly and without emphasis. The way a man says something he has had time to think through completely. He was not angry. He was not triumphant. He had the expression of someone who has been standing at the edge of a thing for a long time and has finally found stable ground. Crane turned and looked at him. Dale said, "Page 14 of the contract you sold me required a written terrain assessment disclosure before I signed. There was no disclosure. Clifton has reported it to the state compliance office. The loan valuation is under review based on a water rights registration that your company did not account for in the terrain survey. Margaret Dowell is representing us." The name landed the way he said it, without drama, as information. Crane stood in the yard for a moment. He looked at Barr, who had stopped walking the rows and was standing at the fence line without any particular expression. He looked at Nora again. She was looking back at him the same way she had looked at him every time he had come to this farm. The same steady, unreadable, patient attention. She was 10 years old, and she looked at him the way the land looked at everyone, without judgment and without urgency, simply registering what was there. He got back in the truck. He drove to the end of the lane and turned onto the county road, and the dust settled behind him evenly and without drama, as if nothing much had happened, which was, Nora thought, exactly how it felt when something important resolved itself correctly. Not loud, not sudden, just complete. Within the week, 3 other families in Harlan County came forward with similar installation contracts from Crane Agritech. 2 of them had paid the repair fees without questioning the warranty exclusion. 1 had already sold. Kenneth Holt from the state compliance office drove down from Lexington the following Thursday and spent 2 days reviewing documents at Barr's office. Margaret Dowell filed the first motion on the Briggs case on a Friday morning. The loan flag held. The transfer agreement was never finalized. Victor Crane's company cooperated with the state review under legal advice, which is a way of saying that the process moved slowly and carefully and without the clean resolution that stories sometimes promise. It moved the way legal processes move, through paperwork and waiting and small decisions that accumulate over months. But it moved. And the direction it moved was not toward the Briggs farm. The men who had handed Nora their old pipe over the course of that July, the ones who had leaned on their fence posts and chuckled at the sight of a small girl loading aluminum irrigation sections onto a bicycle trailer, drove out to the Briggs farm on a Saturday morning in late August. They came separately and then found themselves arriving at roughly the same time, pulling over on the county road and walking the fence line together to look at the north field. The soybeans were not what they would have been in a good rain year. 3 weeks of gravity-fed drip irrigation starting in late July could not recover a full growing season's water deficit, but they were standing. The rows inside the system were green and full, the canopy closing over the middles, the plants carrying pods that had set and filled in the window the water had opened. The rows outside the system were thinner, pale, some of them past recovery. The difference between the rows was a visible line across the field. On one side of the line, a crop. On the other side, what a drought does when nothing intervenes. The men stood at the fence and looked at it for a while without speaking. One of them, a man named Harold Deaton, who had farmed the next ridge over for 34 years and had given Nora 6 sections of aluminum pipe without asking a single question, pulled a pod from the nearest plant and opened it with his thumbnail. He looked at the seeds inside. He looked at the soil around the base of the plant, dark and cohesive from 3 weeks of slow, steady moisture. He looked up at Nora, who was standing at the end of the row. He said, "Walk me through it." So she did. She took them through it the way she had taken Wendell through it, the way she had taken Clifton Barr through it, starting at the collection chamber in the northwest corner and moving down through the main line to the junctions, explaining the pressure logic at each transition, describing what the graduated fittings did and why the diameter sequence mattered, showing them where the draw supplemented the collector tile during a rain event and how the subsurface feed maintained pressure during the dry stretches between. The men walked the system with her and asked questions she answered as completely as she could. When she did not know something, she said so and told them who to ask, which was usually Wendell, who was standing at the edge of the group with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has invested something and is watching it pay out. Several of the men asked if she would help them lay something similar before the next planting season. She said she would. She said it simply, without making it more than it was, the same way she had said everything else about the project from the beginning. Not a promise she was performing, just a thing she intended to do. Dale was standing near the barn during all of this. He did not join the group walking the rows. He watched from a distance the way he had watched his daughter all summer, with the same careful evaluating attention he gave to everything, measuring it against what he knew and revising what he knew when the evidence required it. Iris was sitting in a wooden chair that Dale had carried out from the kitchen and set at the edge of the field that morning without being asked. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the tin box on the ground beside her chair, not holding it, just keeping it close. She had not been to the North Field in several years. Her knees made the uneven ground difficult, but she had asked Dale to bring the chair out, and he had done it. And she had been sitting there since mid-morning watching the men walk the rows and listening to her granddaughter explain the things she had designed 31 years ago and never been permitted to build. At one point, Harold Deaton, walking back from the far end of the system, stopped near Iris's chair and looked at the tin box on the ground. He said, "Is that what I think it is?" Iris said, "It is a box." He said, "Iris, I have been farming next to this property for 34 years. Earl used to say that box was full of old receipts." Iris said Earl said a lot of things. She looked at the North Field. Harold followed her gaze. After a moment, he said she has his stubbornness, the good kind. Iris said, "She has mine." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded, once, and walked on. The afternoon light moved across the ridge the way it does in late August in eastern Kentucky, long and faintly tired, the way summer light gets near the end of itself. The shadows of the soybean rows stretched out across the soil, longer than the plants themselves, pointing east. Nora walked the system one final time when the others had left, checking each emitter, pressing her palm flat against the fittings to feel the pressure, kneeling at the northwest corner to listen to the collector chamber. Everything was running. Everything was holding. She sat down at the end of the last row and looked up the slope toward the house. Dale was on the porch, sitting in the chair he used in the evenings. Iris had been helped back inside by Wren, who had appointed herself her grandmother's assistant for the afternoon and taken the responsibility with great seriousness. Cass was somewhere in the equipment barn, his presence announced at intervals by the sounds of his work crossing the yard. She thought about the letter she had found under the tractor seat in April, the number in the middle of the page and the date beside it. She thought about how 60 days had looked from that crouching position in the barn, unreadable and final, too large to think about whole. She thought about her grandmother at the small desk in the early mornings, the reading glasses and the black coffee and the pamphlets going back 30 years, 31 years of knowing something worked and never being given the ground to prove it. She thought about water, which does not argue, which does not explain itself, which finds what it needs and moves toward it and keeps moving until something stops it, and even then finds the edges of whatever stopped it and moves around them, given enough time. The emitters were still running in the rows around her, each one releasing its small, steady quantity into the ground. The sound was nothing, barely a sound at all, but she could feel it if she put her hand flat on the soil. The faint, cool dampness spreading outward from each brass fitting, the quiet evidence of a thing working exactly as it was designed to work, which is the only evidence that matters in the end. Dale called from the porch that supper was ready. She stood up, brushed the soil from her hands, and walked up the slope toward the house.